Hi, this is Dan, otherwise known as God is My Judge. I wanted to quickly respond to Steve Hayes on his post entitled Red Herrings for Sale on the issue of Frankfurt Examples. First, what is a Frankfurt example? Basically, it's an example designed to disprove the idea that we have the ability to do otherwise, or we require the ability to do otherwise to be morally responsible. And the idea is Mr. Black is monitoring Jones's brain, and if Jones is about to vote Democratic, he'll let him do it and just keep monitoring his brain. But if he's about to vote Republican, he switches a device on that makes Jones choose to vote Democratic anyways. The point of the example is basically to show that if Jones was going to vote Democratic, the intervener doesn't have to do anything. Black doesn't have to do anything, and so intuitively we're supposed to think that Jones is still responsible for his choice, and so that disproves that we need alternative possibilities to be responsible. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and get into the actual exchange that Steve and I had. My comments will be in blue, and Steve's responses will be in red. So the first issue I brought up is there's no sign beforehand. So in the Frankfurt example, the intervener, Mr. Black, knows ahead of time what Jones is going to choose, but there's no such sign. There's nothing like that. And Steve points out that in thought experience, you don't really have to be realistic in all aspects. Well, that's true. I actually agree with that. You can certainly kind of hypothesize, and you can even hypothesize impossible things sometime in thought experiments. So that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. The problem is that this is a very relevant thing. In fact, I would say that it's essential to the thought experiment. And the reason why I say that is this: when you talk about libertarian free will, you're talking about the ability to choose otherwise, giving one causal history, or actually one history before that event. So if you change that history, you're no longer dealing with the question of libertarian free will. So if the sign goes one way in one set where Jones chooses to vote Democratic, and the sign goes another way when he chooses to vote Republican, or he would have chosen to vote Republican. And in that case, what happens is you end up with two causal histories, and that's a big deal. And when you change that and you have two causal histories, you're no longer talking about questions of libertarian free will. So the second side of the thought experiment, the kind of forced choice, so to speak, is completely irrelevant. And the real question is, given the sign that he had in the actual history that he had, is he able to choose otherwise or not? That's the relevant question for libertarian free will. So the sign ahead of time really changes the game, so to speak. And what happens is the other side of the analysis, the counterfactual side, the forced choice side, really becomes an element of misdirection. It becomes a distraction. You think that that's the problem. You think that's what's determining the choice, and that sort of thing. But it's really not, because given the sign that he's going to choose to vote Democratic, if he can't choose Republican, that isn't because of the intervener. So if he can't, what's the reason? There's a hidden determinism within it, and you think that the determinism is going on with the intervener, but it's really not. That's not the issue at all. Something else is determining it. If we decide that he can't choose otherwise, given the sign that he will choose to vote Democratic, and so that's why this issue of sign is just so fundamental. You can't really cast it aside. Let's say you eliminated the sign altogether, and Steve throws out the word foreknowledge. He can't be meaning foreknown, and certainly in the sense of like God's free knowledge, that sort of thing, because obviously that would be a logical loop, because once an event's foreknown, it will happen. So long story short, it would be logically too late to alter at that point. So he can't mean foreknowledge in that sense, but maybe he means foreknowledge in the sense of either something more like a middle knowledge in a Molinistic system, or more so just counterfactual knowledge, God's knowing what hypothetically would happen under such and such circumstances. I believe under Steve's own theory, what he would have to hold is that God would have to determine what that agent would do under either case. So once again, the history preceding an event would be different. In one case, there would be an existence of something predetermining one outcome and something predetermining the other outcome. So long story short, basically within the causal history of the event, there certainly would be something, the existence of something that predetermines the outcome. And that's what's being hidden. So even if you replace the sign with what I think Steve would want to replace the sign with, then what you have is within the history of the event, it changes. In one history, you've got the predetermination of one outcome, and in the other history, you've got the predetermination of a different outcome. And so that's the real issue. And so even if you take the sign out altogether, you still have an extremely relevant aspect of the example. So even though thought experiments can rule certain particulars out, you can't rule out essential elements like this. Okay, so the next issue is the issue of a forced choice, and I think what's happening here is really there's some equivocation. When I'm talking about forced choice, I'm talking about the kind of the counterfactual intervener, the Mr. Black. And in the scenario where Mr. Jones was about to vote Republican, and then the device switches on and it makes Mr. Jones choose Democratic. And what I'm saying is there's no such device that could make someone choose something. And I'm specifically talking about the choice itself, the will. And I think what's happening is that Steve is talking about forcing in the sense of compulsion or that sort of thing. Now, when he talks about William James here, I believe what William James was talking about in terms of forced options was when you get an either-or scenario, so you can't choose one of many things or 100 things or something like that. You only have this or that option, and it has to be, you're kind of in that scenario. So neither one of those is kind of what I'm talking about. So basically, I think what's really happening is we're equivocating, and I'm specifically talking about the forcing of the will, something making someone else choose one specific thing as opposed to other things. That's what I'm talking about. That has to be voluntary. It can't be forced. I agree with what Steve has to say about kind of a gun to your head scenario that does mitigate responsibility. So long story short, I guess what I'm saying is I agree with what Steve's saying, but I just think that his sense of forced choice is different than mine. And I was just talking about the type in the example. Steve's next point is about the immaterial soul, and I brought up basically there's no such thing as a physical device that could rule out the immaterial soul. And then Steve points out that that's irrelevant because thought experiment you can have kind of conjectural type things in it. And basically I agree. I grant him that point. Okay, the last thing is the definition of choose and choice and free will. And the issue is one example would be choose A or not, the ability to choose A or not, and the other is the ability to choose A or B. And Steve's point is it's a distinction without a difference. Basically, it's the same thing. Choose A or not is reducible to choose A or B. I agree. I guess that's true in theory. In practice, though, it doesn't really play out that way. Specifically, in the way people talk about Frankfurt examples, this becomes a really key deal. In this specific example, the ability to choose to vote Democratic or not is very different than the ability to choose either Democratic or Republican. So I think the difference is obvious, but I agree with, in terms of formulating it and putting it into words, maybe I could have been a little bit tighter. But yes, I agree that logically you can reduce A or not to A or B just by shifting the definition of B. But once you've specified what the A and B are, it becomes pretty clear. So the way it works in Frankfurt examples is clear. And the reason why it's such a big deal is, if you got this situation where someone's able to choose Democratic or not, in that case, what happens is you actually have sufficient freedom. If you even forget about that whole issue of the sign, what happens is you have sufficient freedom within the Frankfurt example itself. You basically have a sort of PAP within the Frankfurt example, and the Frankfurt example just doesn't conflict or doesn't bump up against freedom. Now, on the other hand, if it has to be a choice of A or B, the person has to be able to choose Democratic or choose Republican. Then the Frankfurt example seems to be more of an issue. But if it's just limited to choose one or not, then the Frankfurt example fails. Okay, that's all I had to say. God be with you.